The moment the quarantine doors sealed shut, Lieutenant Aaron Caldwell knew he was in serious trouble. The reinforced glass of the isolation chamber reflected his pale face back at him, his short-cropped hair damp with sweat. His body ached, and a dull pressure throbbed behind his eyes. It wasn't fear, at least not entirely. It was the sinking realization that he had caught something, and no one knew what it would do to him. He wasn't alone. The human medical staff stationed on Dalkari 3 had been swept into quarantine with him, all of them exposed to the same unidentified pathogen that was tearing through the alien population. They were in the heart of a crisis, and nobody had answers yet. It had started 3 weeks ago. A mining outpost deep in the northern hemisphere reported an outbreak of an unknown illness. The first cases presented with mild symptoms: fatigue, fever, joint pain. Within days it escalated. Patients developed respiratory failure, internal hemorrhaging, and multi-organ collapse. By the end of the first week, the mortality rate was estimated at 95%. By the time the first medical teams arrived, it was clear the virus had spread beyond the outpost. The Dalkari government issued regional quarantines, attempting to contain the crisis. But the virus was already in major population centers. Soon, hospitals were overwhelmed, emergency response systems collapsed, and entire districts were placed under martial law. No one knew where the virus had come from. Some believed it had originated from deep within the mines, an ancient pathogen released from the permafrost. Others feared it had jumped from an unknown animal species. A few whispered about biological warfare, though there was no evidence to support that theory. For Caldwell and the human personnel stationed on Dalkari 3, the crisis had initially seemed distant. They were stationed in a research facility orbiting the planet, running diplomatic and medical exchange programs. Then, last week, the first human case was confirmed. The alarms blared through the station, warning lights flashing red as medical officers rushed to contain the situation. 3 humans, Caldwell among them, had tested positive. The virus had jumped species. Now, he sat in the sterile white walls of the isolation unit, staring at the ceiling as the soft hum of the air filtration system filled the silence. A transparent barrier separated him from the outside world, where alien doctors in bulky biohazard suits observed him from behind reinforced glass. Dr. Velen, the lead xenobiologist assigned to the case, appeared on the screen embedded in the wall. His grayish-blue skin looked paler than usual, exhaustion visible even through his protective visor. "Lieutenant Caldwell, how are you feeling?" "Like I got run over by a freighter," Caldwell muttered. His throat was raw. He cleared it before continuing. "How bad is it?" Velen hesitated. "Your symptoms appear manageable for now. You're running a high fever, but your vitals remain stable." Caldwell exhaled slowly. That was something, at least. "And the others?" Velen's expression darkened. 2 are in critical condition. One, Dr. Evelyn Carter, is showing signs of stabilization. Caldwell frowned. "Why the difference?" "We don't know yet," Velen admitted. "Your kind is reacting differently to the virus than we expected. The mortality rate among Dalkari is staggeringly high, but you and your colleagues are still fighting it." "Still fighting," Caldwell echoed. "But we don't know if we'll win." Velen's silence was answer enough. The next few days were hell. Caldwell drifted in and out of fevered sleep, the virus running rampant through his system. His body ached, his head throbbed, and his muscles felt like they were slowly dissolving. But he was still alive. The Dalkari weren't so lucky. Every day the death toll climbed. Hospitals on the planet were overflowing, mass graves were being dug outside city centers, and the planetary government was barely maintaining order. Quarantine zones were collapsing as desperate citizens tried to flee infected areas. Off-world travel was shut down entirely. The Galactic Council convened emergency meetings, debating whether full-scale planetary isolation was necessary. If enacted, no ships, Dalkari or otherwise, would be allowed in or out. It would mean abandoning the entire population to its fate. Human virologists working with the Dalkari medical teams scrambled for answers. They sequenced the virus's genome, searching for weaknesses, but there were no obvious solutions. The virus was brilliant in its lethality, mutating rapidly, evading immune responses, adapting to new hosts. It didn't behave like anything they had encountered before. and yet humans were surviving it. By day 5, Caldwell's fever broke. He woke up drenched in sweat, his body weak, but his mind clearer than it had been in days. His muscles still ached, but the raw, burning sensation in his lungs had faded. He was getting better. Dr. Velen was there within minutes, his expression unreadable behind the face shield. "You're improving." Caldwell sat up slowly. "Yeah, looks like I won't be dying today." Velen didn't share the humor. "We need to understand why." He gestured toward the screen, where Caldwell's latest blood work was displayed in complex, shifting data sets. "Your immune system fought off the virus in a way we did not anticipate. The infection triggered an aggressive response, but unlike the Dalkari, your body didn't succumb to the inflammation cascade. It adapted." Caldwell frowned. "And Carter?" "She is also improving. But the third human patient, Ruiz, is not recovering as quickly." Caldwell's stomach tightened. "So it's not universal." No, Velen's voice was grim. "Something in your biology is giving you an edge, but it is not absolute. We need to analyze your immune response at a molecular level, compare it with your colleagues, and determine if there is a pattern." Caldwell rubbed a hand over his face. "You think our bodies hold the key to stopping this?" Velen's gaze was steady. "I think it may be the only chance we have." Over the next 48 hours, the medical teams ran relentless tests. Blood samples, tissue biopsies, immune markers, every possible variable was analyzed. Patterns began to emerge. Some humans carried a genetic mutation that allowed for a more aggressive immune response, limiting the virus's ability to take hold. Others did not. It wasn't a magic cure. It wasn't universal immunity. But it was something. The research teams worked around the clock, attempting to isolate the specific genetic markers responsible. If they could replicate the immune response in a controlled way, it could be the foundation for a treatment. Not a miracle cure, not an instant fix, but a fighting chance. And on a planet where millions were dying, that was more than enough reason to keep fighting. The results took time. The medical teams worked in rotating 18-hour shifts, running the data through every possible angle. Every variable, genetic, environmental, metabolic, was scrutinized, cross-referenced, and modeled. The answer had to be in there somewhere. Caldwell, now mostly recovered, had been moved from the critical quarantine chamber to a monitored recovery ward. He wasn't free to leave, but at least he wasn't strapped to a bed with an IV anymore. It had been 8 days since his fever broke, and he still felt weak. His muscles hadn't fully regained their strength, and his appetite was returning in strange bursts. 1 minute, he felt like he could eat an entire field's worth of rations. The next, the very idea of food made his stomach turn. Dr. Velen had warned him that the human immune response, being so aggressive, likely had lingering effects. A post-viral syndrome, as one of the Terran doctors called it. But despite that, Caldwell was recovering, and that meant he could help. His first stop, still escorted by 2 armed guards in full protective gear, was the primary research lab. Behind layers of reinforced glass, Carter sat at a workbench, a tablet in her hands. Unlike Caldwell, who had fought through his infection with sheer stubbornness, she was taking a different approach, throwing herself into work the moment she could stand upright. "You're looking better," she muttered without looking up. "Not dead yet." "Not today," Caldwell replied, stepping up to the glass divider. "How's Ruiz?" Carter hesitated. "Still in bad shape. He hasn't crashed, but his fever isn't breaking the way ours did. They don't know if he's turning a corner, or if." She let the sentence hang. Caldwell clenched his jaw. "They figure out why we're recovering." Sort of. Carter finally set her tablet down. "It's not immunity, not in the way we thought. The virus still wrecked us, it just didn't kill us. Turns out our immune response is way more aggressive than the Dalkari's." Caldwell frowned. "I thought their system was supposed to be more advanced." "It is against known threats. Their immune system is highly specialized. But this virus, it's a completely novel pathogen to them. Their bodies don't recognize it, and by the time their immune response kicks in, the damage is already too severe. And ours." Carter leaned forward. "Our immune systems, they attack everything hard. The Dalkari immune system is like a sniper, precise, controlled, waiting for the perfect shot. Ours? More like a shotgun blast. Overwhelming force. Even at the risk of collateral damage. Our bodies fought the virus into submission before it could reach fatal levels. Caldwell ran a hand through his hair. So that's why Ruiz is struggling? His immune system didn't hit back fast enough. Something like that, she sighed. We're trying to map out exactly why our responses differ. There's a genetic component for sure, but there might also be environmental factors, previous infections, hell, even gut bacteria could play a role. It's a mess. But if we figure it out, we might be able to induce the same immune response in the Dalkari, train their bodies to react faster. Caldwell let out a slow breath. How long? Carter gave him a tired look. Best case scenario? Weeks? Realistically? Months? Maybe years. That hit hard. The Dalkari didn't have months. The death toll was still rising. The virus had burned through the major cities, overwhelming the hospitals and quarantine zones. Entire districts were uninhabitable, emergency cremation centers running day and night to prevent secondary outbreaks. The situation had gotten so bad that the Dalkari High Council had enacted emergency wartime measures. Civilian travel was halted, curfews enforced, and every available resource redirected to containment and medical efforts. But despite their best efforts, new cases kept appearing. The virus was too good at spreading. Caldwell sat in his room, watching the latest report feed from the orbital station. He saw the numbers, the footage, the faces of the medical teams working until they collapsed from exhaustion. And yet, outside the human quarantine ward, life continued as normal for the Terran personnel. None of them had gotten sick. That fact sat heavy in his mind. A new idea emerged from the research teams. If they couldn't cure the Dalkari, maybe they could delay the infection. It was Carter who first proposed it. Look, we don't have time to engineer a miracle treatment. But if we can find a way to trigger an early immune response before the virus takes full hold, maybe we can give them a fighting chance. Velen was skeptical. You're talking about an immune stimulant. If administered too aggressively, it could trigger autoimmune reactions, organ failure. Carter cut him off. We wouldn't be introducing anything foreign. We'd just be tricking their bodies into reacting sooner. A controlled stressor, something to mimic early infection and kickstart the immune response before the virus spreads out of control. Caldwell leaned forward. Like a vaccine. Not exactly. More like a warning shot. Velen exchanged glances with his team. And you believe this will work? Carter exhaled. We won't know until we try. The first test subjects were carefully selected. Dalkari civilians who had been exposed but weren't yet showing symptoms. They were divided into controlled groups, each receiving different levels of immune stimulation under strict medical supervision. The results were mixed at first. Some patients showed mild improvement. Others reacted too aggressively, their bodies fighting off the false alarm but leaving them weakened. The balance was razor thin. But then, a breakthrough. One of the test subjects, a young Dalkari woman named Seville, contracted the virus 3 days into the trial. The normal trajectory should have put her in critical condition within 48 hours. Instead, she stabilized. Her body was fighting back. The Dalkari immune system could be trained, at least in some cases, to react earlier. If this response could be replicated across the population, it could buy them time. And time was everything. Caldwell watched as the first wave of stimulant treatments rolled out to at-risk populations. It was a logistical nightmare. Doses had to be carefully tailored to individuals, side effects monitored, adjustments made. The process was slow, grueling. But for the first time since the outbreak began, the death rate started to plateau. It wasn't a cure, but it was the first real step toward survival. The stimulant treatment wasn't a miracle, but it was the first real foothold in a war they had been losing. The medical teams expanded the trials, refining dosages, adjusting administration schedules, monitoring long-term effects. The results weren't perfect. Some Dalkari still fell critically ill despite early intervention, but for the first time, survival rates increased. Not dramatically. Not enough to call it a true turning point, but enough to buy time. and time meant options. By now, Caldwell was back to full strength. His body still ached when he pushed too hard, and he'd lost weight from the fever, but compared to the chaos outside the quarantine ward, he was lucky. Ruiz wasn't. His fever had finally broken, but the virus had left him too weak. His lungs had taken a beating, his body struggling to regain function. He could barely speak above a whisper. Caldwell sat beside his bed in the recovery unit, watching his friend's shallow breathing. "How long was I out?" Ruiz rasped, his voice barely audible. "Too damn long," Caldwell said. Ruiz gave a weak smile. "Figures. I never do things the easy way." Caldwell exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You scared the hell out of us, man." Ruiz coughed, a dry, painful sound. "Guess I'm not built like you." That hit harder than Caldwell expected. Because it was true. Why had some humans survived easily while others barely scraped through? The research team still didn't have a solid answer. "We're working on it," Caldwell said, trying to figure out what made some of us recover faster. "Better hurry," Ruiz muttered, closing his eyes. "Feels like my immune system missed the memo." Caldwell sat back, jaw tight. They needed answers. Over the next week, the real work began. The early response stimulant had given them breathing room, but it wasn't enough. If they wanted a true solution, they needed to understand what made humans different, not just why they survived, but how they fought off the virus so effectively. Velen's research teams worked with human virologists, combing through genetic data, immune response logs, cellular structures. Caldwell, Carter, and Ruiz, along with every other surviving human, underwent further testing. Patterns emerged. First, genetic markers. Some humans had naturally higher baseline immune activity. Their bodies reacted to new infections almost instantly, overwhelming viruses before they could take hold. Second, environmental factors. Humans had a history of exposure to a wider variety of pathogens compared to the Dalkari. The theory was simple: a lifetime of fighting diverse infections had given them a more adaptable immune system. But the third discovery was the most important. Humans who had survived severe infections in the past, malaria, tuberculosis, certain strains of influenza, showed the strongest resistance to the alien virus. Their immune systems weren't just faster, they were trained. Caldwell had heard theories before about how past illnesses shaped immune function, but now, looking at the data, it was undeniable. And that changed everything. "If prior infection history plays a role, we can replicate that," Carter said in the lab, her voice sharp with excitement. Velen folded his arms. "You mean exposing the Dalkari to controlled infections?" "Not exactly," Carter replied, "but we can mimic the process. We already know immune training works, our stimulant treatments prove that. Now we just need to take it further." Caldwell frowned. "How?" Carter gestured toward the research monitors. "We create a safe viral analog, something non-lethal that triggers a preemptive immune response. If we can train their bodies the same way ours have been trained over generations, we might be able to artificially accelerate their immune adaptation." Velen tapped his fingers against his console, deep in thought. "It would have to be engineered carefully. Too strong, and we risk triggering severe immune complications. Too weak, and it won't be effective. But if it works..." Caldwell began. Velen nodded. "It could change everything." The first trials took 2 more weeks to develop. They worked off existing immune stimulant models, modifying viral proteins to simulate infection without actual harm. The idea was simple: a vaccine-like response, but designed for an immune system that had never seen anything like this before. The first test subjects were high-risk Dalkari volunteers. Their response was slower than humans, but it was there. The immune system, once blind to the virus, was now learning. The body recognized the threat earlier. The virus struggled to gain a foothold. It wasn't perfect. Some patients still succumbed to the disease, but the survival rate climbed. First by 5%, then 10%. And as the trials continued, the trend held steady. The virus was losing its grip. But they weren't done yet. They had stopped the immediate freefall, but the virus was still out there mutating, evolving. The next challenge was ensuring long-term immunity. We need booster sequences, Carter said, scrolling through projected immune response data. Right now they're surviving, but we don't know if the protection will last. Caldwell nodded. How long would natural adaptation take? Velen exhaled. Generations. Then we don't wait, Carter said. We engineer it. The final stage of the project was immune reinforcement therapy, a way to sustain the trained immune response over time. They worked on methods to introduce long-term cellular memory, ensuring that even if the virus resurfaced, the body would be ready. It would take months to refine, years to perfect. But it was happening. And that meant one thing. Dalkari 3 would survive. Caldwell stood at the viewport of the orbital station, looking down at the planet below. The emergency signals that had once flooded the airwaves had slowed. The death toll had stabilized. The Galactic Council had lifted the planetary isolation order, allowing medical shipments and aid workers back onto the surface. It wasn't over. Not completely. But the worst had passed. Carter leaned against the railing beside him. You think they'll be okay? Caldwell let out a slow breath. They're fighters. A pause. Then Carter smirked. I meant you. You spent weeks in quarantine, got hit with a near-fatal alien virus, and somehow walked out of it fine. Caldwell chuckled. Yeah, guess I did. She studied him. You ever wonder why? He didn't answer right away. Because he already knew. Humanity had never been the strongest, the fastest, or the most advanced species in the galaxy, but they were adaptable. They faced the impossible and found a way through. And now? Now, an entire species owed their survival to that relentless, infuriating, impossible human trait. They fought. And they lived. It took another 3 weeks before the situation on Dalkari 3 was stable enough for Caldwell to step outside without seeing funeral processions. The virus wasn't gone, but it was contained. The immune stimulant treatments had saved thousands, and the engineered viral analogs had pushed the survival rate past 40%. The death toll was still devastating, but the extinction event that had once seemed inevitable had been averted. For the first time since the outbreak began, the Dalkari had a future again. The Galactic Council sent an envoy to assess the situation. Caldwell sat in the main debriefing hall of the orbital station, watching as representatives from over a dozen species reviewed the medical reports, the treatment protocols, and the projected recovery timeline. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to unease. Humanity had not only survived an alien virus that wiped out 95% of its hosts, but had also found a way to fight it. And some people found that terrifying. One of the council members, a tall, reptilian Othrin, leaned forward. Your species, adapted to this pathogen in a matter of days. That is highly unusual. Caldwell kept his expression neutral. Lucky genetics. The Othrin's eyes narrowed. Luck had little to do with it. Your kind is resistant to a virus that nearly wiped out an entire civilization. That raises concerns. Concerns. Of course. Because in the eyes of the Galactic Council, biological resilience was a weapon. If humans could survive infections that other species could not, it meant they could colonize worlds that were death traps to everyone else. It meant they could walk unscathed through biological warfare. It meant they were dangerous. Carter, who sat beside Caldwell, folded her arms. We just saved a species from extinction. If that's a problem for you, then maybe you need to rethink your priorities. A few of the representatives bristled at her tone, but the Dalkari envoy Minister Jalek spoke before anyone else could. Humanity is not a threat, he said firmly. They are the reason my people still exist. Silence. Then the discussion moved on. After the meeting, Minister Jalek approached Caldwell in the corridor. The Dalkari leader looked exhausted, deep lines etched into his usually smooth features, his posture weighed down by grief. Caldwell had seen similar looks on human leaders during times of crisis. Lieutenant Jalek said, "A moment." Caldwell nodded. Of course. Jalek studied him. We owe you more than we can ever repay. You don't owe me anything, Caldwell said. It was a team effort. Jalek exhaled, perhaps. But it was your people who found a solution. Your people who resisted this disease. Your people who fought for us when others wanted to abandon my world. Caldwell didn't have an answer for that. Jalek extended a small, silver insignia, a Dalkari symbol of honor. This is given only to those who have safeguarded our future. You and your kind have earned it. Caldwell hesitated, then took the insignia. It was cold against his palm. Jalek's voice dropped lower. There are those who fear your kind now. They see your resilience and wonder if it makes you too powerful. Caldwell smirked. We're still human. We get sick, we bleed, we die just like everyone else. Jalek gave him a long look. No, not like everyone else. Then he turned and walked away. With the crisis under control, the Terran Confederation began pulling its medical teams back to Earth. The Dalkari had what they needed now. Recovery would take time, but their species would survive. Caldwell stood on the observation deck, watching as the last few shuttles left for the surface. The planet below still bore the scars of the outbreak, whole districts abandoned, emergency zones still in effect, but life was returning. Carter joined him, crossing her arms. You think they'll be okay? Caldwell let out a slow breath. Yeah, I do. She studied him. You staying on Earth after this? Caldwell considered it. He had spent years in space, moving from one assignment to the next. Maybe it was time to go home. But as he looked down at Dalkari 3, at the world that had nearly been lost, at the species that had almost vanished, he realized something. This was his home now. Not this planet, not this system, but out here, where humanity was proving itself in ways no one had ever expected. Not yet, he said finally. There's still work to do. Carter smirked. Figures. A soft chime echoed through the station boarding call for the last shuttle to the Terran fleet. Caldwell took one last look at Dalkari 3, then turned and walked toward the future.